Everyone hits a bump in the road. What do you do with it? Be inspired as we explore the ways people experience, navigate, and manage the ups and downs and twists and turns in this road trip called life. Welcome to another episode of Bump in the Road. The basic podcast is always free. We also have a premium subscription called Bump 2 that lets you listen in on extended behind-the-scenes conversations with our guests. Check it out at www.bumpintheroad.us. At the age of 16, Brooklyn-born Mitch Presnick decided that China offered the type of wide-open business opportunity that he sought. He spent 2 years at Peking University learning Chinese. With a grasp of the language and a bit of the culture, Mitch sought opportunity, and he found it. Mitch became the founder of Super 8 Hotels China with over 1,000 locations throughout the PRC. Along the way, he encountered more than a few bumps in the road, including a franchise revolt that nearly cost him everything. Through his adventures in China, Mitch developed a love of Chinese culture. He learned to meditate and studied Taoism, Confucian philosophy, and Tibetan Buddhism. Mitch is an American entrepreneur that sees the world a bit differently than many of us. Please welcome him to Bump in the Road. Mitch, welcome to Bump in the Road. If you would, tell us your story.
Hi, Pat. It's nice to be here with you. I've got an unusual story in that it's not a story about one country or one theme. So I've spent 26 years total in the U.S. I was born in Brooklyn. But then I lived for 30 years in Beijing and Hong Kong. And so I'm really kind of at this point more of sort of a globalist who now is living back in the U.S. And my China story began when I was 16, and my uncle had just come back from a trip, and he cornered me at my sister's bat mitzvah and said, "You've really got to go to China. China is the future." And they've just opened up their markets after, more than 30 years of isolation. And somebody needs to go over there and bring American brands and American business ideas, because they're just getting started and they're going to probably want all of those things. And after a couple of years of looking at it, and I didn't really have a lot of better options, and plus it sounded really exciting, I decided to go to China, learn Chinese, and then build a business there. I was going to try to come from the future, bring an American idea that hadn't yet developed there, and I was going to just deliver it in a way that was, culturally relevant. So after studying at Peking University for 2 years and learning to read and write and speak Chinese, I moved to Hong Kong and worked for American companies that were doing business in China and going across the border. At that time, Hong Kong GDP was about 25% of China's GDP. So it was a really major city, kind of, the New York of Asia, as it were. And but my goal was always to get back into China. And so luckily, I was invited to help Budweiser develop the Budweiser brand in China. And I was part of that team for 8 years. And with about a 1.5% share volume-wise of the Chinese beer market, we ended up developing about 10% profit pool from so in other words, we were 10 times as profitable as the average Chinese beer producer. And I learned from Budweiser how they did it. And then I went and did it for my own company. I went and bought the rights for the American economy hotel brand Super 8. And then I had to go raise money. We didn't have the brand and we didn't have the money, but I went to the money and I said, I've got the brand. And then I went to the brand owners and I said, I've got the money, and somehow sort of pulled the Brooklyn deal and we were able to develop it. And we opened our first hotel in right in the heart of Beijing in Wangfujing in 2004. And then when I exited the business to a private equity fund, we had just around 11 or 1,200 hotels. And so it was a really on that level. It sounds like a really successful project, but there was about 4 or 5 near-death experiences in there, as it were. So I've had both personal and business near-death experiences. I almost died in a car accident when I was 20, and that was a very impactful event in my life because still in college and just sort of like every other college kid, just trying to figure it all out. But somehow, as a result of this car accident, I decided that since it would have been so easy for me to just not have this future that I was now living. So it seemed to me that everything was a free play at this point, and it completely changed my philosophy on life, and it took away any fear of failure or concern about risk. In fact, I have something of a tin ear to risk now, which isn't always good as an investor, but I don't really see risk as I used to see it, which was in absolute terms. This is risky to do this. I now have this curse where I can look at risk in relative terms. There's a risk of doing this, but then there's the usually greater risk of not doing this. And when you start to look at things in terms of relative risk, which I couldn't do until I had resolved a lot of the latent fears that I had about what was the future going to look like, and how successful could I be, and what makes me think I could do this or that. All of that evaporated with this car accident, and it also, I think it's a great lesson about how life is not really about what happens to us. It's entirely about what story we give ourselves about what happens to us, right? Because a lot of people might have taken the theme from that event to be, oh, life is really inherently risky and fragile and precious, so let me just avoid all risk and try to stay here as long as possible. But I took the opposite story, and they're just stories, right? You can choose your story. I happened to choose a story which was accretive for me to do things which would help me pursue my dreams as I saw them, which was to live an extraordinary life and to live a life of meaning, and to try to experience life on a human level that maybe was more than I had been seeking when I was younger. I wasn't just trying to figure out how to get by. I was looking at life kind of as an all-day pass at an amusement park, and there's no wrong way to do that, right? But the problem is if you aren't thoughtful about how you do that, then what you end up with could very well deviate from what you originally hoped, and that would be a shame. Anyway, I guess those are some of the themes of my story so far. We're still writing the story.
I'm pretty fascinated by the topic of risk. Because I think when you eliminate risk, all of a sudden you become very present.
Well, that's right. I mean, look, everything in life is about how do we avoid the things that are taking us out of the moment. The moment is where it's at. This is something that philosophers and intellectuals and successful people have been saying since time immemorial, is that if you're in the moment, you're in the zone. And if you're not in the moment, you're not in the zone. And all your power is in the zone. So stay here in the moment. And all the things that we think of as well-meaning humans with outdated software, I guess, is that, things like hope and concern and second guessing, these are just sensible things we do in order to live a smart life. But actually what they're doing is taking us out of the moment. Even hope, excessive hope, you're now placing your happiness into the future, and you're using that future happiness as a driver. But then by definition, if you're out there in the future enjoying some future success, you're not here in the moment where you need to be. And the problem with risk and fear, and why I think it's so important for people to try to rise above it, is you're never in the moment if you're in fear. you're never in the moment if you're concerned about risks. It's really healthy to be considerate of risk. I'm not suggesting anything other than that, but it has to be here with us, where we are, where we can do something about it, where our creativity and where our that sort of magical flow state that we can get into is present. There's nowhere else you can find it. Problem with, and that's why I think there's a million different ways to get over one's fear. I meditate twice a day. I have a fairly regimented schedule of cold showers, and I read an entry from my book on Stoicism every day, and I've been doing that. These are things I've been doing for 30, 40 years now in some cases. But the point is, all of these things are designed for one purpose: to get me in the moment and to get me out of fear, so that I have the potential to accomplish whatever I'm capable of, to do, right? And the problem is, if we're living in fear, or if we're not in the moment, we'll never really know what we're capable of, because a human in the moment, in a state of equanimity, is 100 times more powerful than a human in a state of fear or risk aversion.
I think all creativity actually exists in the moment. And moment by moment, you get to create. So it becomes a question of what do you choose to create? And I think fear isolates you from that moment and isolates you from your own creativity.
Well, I think that's exactly right. I mean, and on the topic of creativity, I think it's really worth noting that, if you're right-handed like me, then creativity doesn't come quite as easily. And when we think of creativity, what we forget is that the right brain, where creativity resides, or most of creativity resides, artistic usage and creativity. When we're over reliant on our left brain, our logic brain, what's happening is we're sort of like a twin engine diesel boat that's running one engine at 95% and the other at 10%, and that's going to create an imbalanced forward motion, right? You're constantly trying to correct for the imbalance between the two hemispheres. So I actually, believe it or not, for completely practical reasons, I spend 20 minutes a day on creativity related exercises, just to try to balance out the two hemispheres of my brain, because I'm so heavy on logic.
Well, I think our society forces us into this kind of linear, so-called logical approach to things. And it has value, analytical value, but I think it kind of misses the essence of the soul. When I spoke to Jill Bolta-Taylor, who was a Harvard brain researcher for years, she did My Stroke of Insight, and she has a new book out called Whole Brain Living, and it addresses exactly what you're talking about, how we have these different aspects of the brain, how they have different strengths and weaknesses. And the essence of her book is to teach us how to coordinate and integrate the functions of these four parts of the brain that she defines and live with, as she says, whole brain living.
That's fascinating.
It's a great, I recommend this book to everybody. I think it is potentially life-changing, particularly when it comes to facing your own fears.
Well, I think that's right. I mean, these are the central themes that have driven my life. You've hit on two of them: balance and finding the balance in duality, and things that don't otherwise look like they're balanced and have duality. I think that's another theme that I think about a lot, but you've hit on two of them for sure. And balancing the two hemispheres is the practical reason why I strengthen my creativity. But yeah, once you start seeing things in a dualistic sense around us, it's hard not to see it everywhere, even in what apparently look like separate or disparate, entities.
How would you define duality?
I would define duality as something kind of holding two separate states, and that usually one is more apparent or more desirable from the point of view of the observer. So, for example, like an easy one, light is both a particle and a wave. And we know that it would be silly to try to define light as one or the other when it only makes sense to look at light as a duality holding entity of these two separate states. And I think that's true for humans. It's obviously true, for example, for material. We know that when you look up closely enough at all material, it all dissolves into atoms, which are mostly air and energy. And what we think we're seeing is material. We're actually seeing energy. And I think that like there's duality everywhere. There's duality in U.S. and China. Culturally, U.S. and China appear very different. But what's always struck me as someone who spent half my life in one place and half in the other is actually they make sense when you look at them together. There's a yin yang aspect to U.S. China cultural complementary, energy. The U.S. is very, very individualistic. We were founded on ideas of pursuit of happiness and freedom. China is a place which celebrates the Confucian ideal, collectivism, and duality is a cell in your body that is both conducting individual functions that that's its raison d'etre, its reason for being here. But on the other hand, it has no purpose unless it's part of the body. Like, what would a cell be doing by itself out there? So I think, in the US, we might look at that cell and focus more on its individual functions and then look at the sum of all of these individual cells and then look at how they work together. And that's kind of our view. We're good at exploding things out into their basic components and understanding them that way. But there's also a holistic way of looking at things, which I think China is quite good at, because they have so much history looking at things from a collectivist lens, through a collectivist lens. And then as someone who kind of now has kind of one foot in this culture and one foot in that culture, it's extremely empowering to be able to see things simultaneously from both points of view and not be beholden to one or the other, because they both have limitations, right? The needs of the group are more important than the needs of the individual in a collectivist system, any collectivist system. But there are times when that's extremely regrettable, especially if you're the individual who's impacted. So I think that duality to me is looking at these things together and trying to find the hidden synergies.
I want to go back to something you said earlier about meditation. How did you get into meditation?
I got into meditation for the same reason I get into everything. I had some practical desire, and then I had to figure out a spiritual way to address the practical desire. I was in China. I had started a public affairs firm for an American K Street lobbying firm, and I was stressed out. We were trying to develop business. I didn't really have a budget that I could spend. It was basically eat what you kill, and so there was a lot of stress. There seems to be a common theme in a lot of my businesses, which is stressful beginnings. And I realized that my workouts weren't doing it for me anymore. Like just working out and whatever. And a friend of mine said, "Gee, you really ought to meditate." And I, like a lot of Westerners, I had there were connotations of Buddhism and connotations of religion and the whole thing, which I wasn't really interested in. But I said, no, actually, meditation has nothing to do with those things. It's really more about just allowing your mind to separate from from your ego, and I didn't really understand what they meant by that at the time, but I decided to start meditating because it was a way to offer some balance to what was otherwise a pretty stressful life, and the fact that I was doing it in China, that was just a ready place. If you get up at 5:30 or 6 in the morning and you walk around any street in Beijing, you'll see older people doing qigong or tai chi or meditating or just whatever. And so there's a lot of cultural encouragement there towards mindfulness, at least for the older generation that I saw. And so it was nice. It was nice to sort of have that kind of feeling that I was sinking in, more directly with the local culture as I did it. But I did it for reasons of stress management originally.
Was there a type of meditation that appealed to you?
Yeah, I originally started with, it was very popular at the time, with a recording of certain frequencies that apparently activated the brain into states of calm. It never really worked for me. I love the concept of it, that one could use technology to access spiritual growth. That's a theme I still really enjoy today. But so much of it is just getting you one step further, right? It got me to start meditating, but I very quickly figured out that using these biurnal rhythms weren't going to really do it. So I went the other way. I went to a total silence method, which is sort of TCM method, which is a popular non-religious, non-spiritual way to meditate. And since then, of course, I've become kind of an avid follower of certain philosophers, including Alan Watts and Sadhguru and Osho and Krishnamurti and others who help me understand meditation from different points of view. But I've always believed meditation is one of the strongest business tools that a founder or an entrepreneur or manager can use, because the mind is so much more powerful than what we think it is. But between the fear and the stress and the exhaustion and the separating our focus out, as I like to say, frittering our universe, our focus out all over the universe. It's very important that we look at the mind as a tool to be preserved and enhanced, right? And especially in business, where your mind is everything, it's so important that we find ways to increase its use, efficiency and capability, and that's meditation. There's nothing else like it.
No, I think meditation is a total game changer. For me, I find peace. I find a greater awareness, an intangible greater connection, and most of all, it translates into my everyday life. I can always separate myself from my monkey mind. I can recognize what it's saying or doing and decide if I want to listen or not. But it gives me the tool to have greater presence in the midst of chaos. And that chaos can just be, the normal junk of life. It could be real chaos, whatever. But it allows me to really decide what's important, focus on it, and that alone, and get it done. Then I can move to the next item. And I find that having that kind of serial focus really is productive.
Yeah, it's too bad that many people hear about ideas like mindfulness and meditation and these things in purely as an esoteric set of values, to pursue, instead of how practically applicable they are to modern life. One of the successful founders that I follow is Dr. Peter Diamandis, and he's sort of a master of looking at these ideas. But in general, I would say that Silicon Valley, I think, if you look at different parts of the U.S. anyway, you kind of ask what is the currency of some of these great cities here. New York, obviously, the currency is money. Cambridge, where I am, the currency is ideas. And sort of, but in Silicon Valley, the currency is really power. I mean, people don't care how much money you have. Maybe a few real estate brokers care, but other than that, nobody cares what you're wearing or whatever. But they do care how much power you wield through your ideas. Look at the Google founders. Look at Naval Ravikant, Tim Ferriss. I mean, I think that, and every one of them is using mindfulness and spirituality on a practical level, to help enhance, their life utility, right? But it also happens to be very pleasurable to live a life where we can separate from our mind at will, and we understand that we're not our mind. Most people don't realize that. Most people don't realize that because it's one of those things that one must heuristically experience, and have prima facie evidence that this is the way it is. Until you meditate, you don't really understand that you can observe your thoughts. One doesn't observe that until they meditate, and then one won't know that until they observe it. Right? These are not the kind of things that I can tell you. Hey, this is the way it is. Those are the sorts of learnings that we can't do through others.
Oh, absolutely. It's very experiential. It's kind of like you can't know hot till you know cold, dark till you know light. You can't know quiet and peace until you get out of your mind.
That's right. Yeah. That's a theme that Alan Watts talks about quite a lot. The idea that what would sound in music be like without the silence in between, and yet we don't think about the silences. It would just be noise, right? Just random noise. But it's always this dance between these two opposites that makes it something.
And that goes back to duality.
Yeah, it sure does. Everything does.
Now, when you were in China, you developed an interest in a lot of Chinese philosophy, including Tibetan Buddhism. I've always been kind of a fan of Buddhism, and I'm a casual observer. But one of the things I like about it is the fact that it really focuses on self-empowerment, self-responsibility in terms of making your choices and building your life. What do you take away from Tibetan Buddhism, and how is Tibetan Buddhism different from some of the other sects?
Well, first of all, I think it's an interesting to note that in Western religions or philosophies, usually there is a focus on the God that's out there, or the energy that's out there, something that we should have faith in and love and worship and show respect to. Eastern philosophies and religions, although I'd say it's easier to think of them in terms of philosophies than religions, and it's also easier for those that are from a Western religion to think of it that way, because that way there's really no conflict. They don't have any inner conflict. Are they being disrespectful to their original religion? The Buddha's Four Noble Truths are true no matter what else is true, and that's okay because it's not a competing religion so much. It's just a philosophy. But I think that the Western religions are different in that they look for the energy that's out there, whereas Eastern philosophies and religions like Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism, these focus on the either our relationship with the world around us, or they focus on the part of the divinity within ourselves, as it were, right? And even Western religions talk about the divinity within us, but it's just not emphasized as much. Again, these are all matters of continuum points, right? I mean, to say I can't say one only focuses on the divinity out there or the divinity within, but they're on a continuum. One is emphasized more on the So Tibetan Buddhism, for me, what I find really interesting about Tibetan Buddhism is it kind of provides an overlay to the idea that this is all there is. Like earlier in our conversation, I mentioned that I always had looked at life as sort of an all-day pass at the amusement park, and how do we make it meaningful, and how do we make sure that whatever we do, we've tried to solve for the variables in our own equation as we define them, as opposed to listening to someone else's view of how it should be. But inherent in that philosophy is the idea that there's just one go around. In Tibetan Buddhism, I think it's a very important distinction, or all Buddhism for that matter, is the idea that we're not the ego we think we are. Like, we're not what we think we are. We're this ego that's designed and by definition has to be focused on some selfish things in order to survive and thrive in this world, and we're this ego that has to protect ourselves. But Buddhism kind of talks about how life is about the lessons we learned from life, and then we're going to keep coming back into life as in different forms, and then through coming in through these different forms, we're going to be learning all the different lessons. So when they talk about like sort of reincarnation, they're not necessarily referring to it in the same way that we think of it, where we have a soul and that soul may go somewhere afterwards, and it's kind of like us, but it has wings. It's very much like, anyone that meditates a lot as you do, can attest to this, that, you start to get away from the part of us that has any real dog in this fight, and we sort of get to kind of an objective observational place where it's more about what lessons we're learning, how much wisdom we've created, how much connection have we created with the world around us, and so there's a bit of an advantage when looking at the world from this way. First of all, it tends to create more equanimity and connection with others, because it's less about my one go around. I have to make the most of it, and if this person's in the way, then they're they become part of the problem. When you look at the world from a Buddhist point of view, you do tend to see a world which encourages more synergy and acceptance. And there can be a certain amount of amusement about things that would otherwise upset us, because it's not directly related to whether we're going to be okay, whether this other idea or happening is negative or positive to us here. And since you're looking at the world in terms of longer timelines, it also means one can be more amused by things that would otherwise upset you. That can be really powerful, right? To be able to use whatever comes at us in a way, right? There's always a 2-level game being played. Every human is playing a 2-level game, right? There's all the things we want to do and all of the problems we're trying to overcome and the daily challenges. And we think it's about those things, kind of like, if you're playing a really engaging video game and it's all immersive and you're in it, anyone that's tried one of those virtual reality simulators can say it's very real, where you feel yourself falling and it's your heart will race and it becomes very real. But in fact, you're just wearing you're wearing an eyepiece and some headphones, and you can pull it off. I think it's helpful to use Buddhism to sort of have that advantage.
Well, I go back to what you said about having an emphasis on learning in Buddhism. And I think when you have an emphasis on learning, particularly about yourself, you learn about others. And the more you learn, I think the more you develop compassion. Because if you truly understood anyone else's story, you would have to have compassion for them.
It's funny. I really think we're at a crossroads as a species. I think there's very, very little we can do at this point with such a huge gap between the development of our neural networks and the technology that we've created, right? Our technology is now starting to outrun our ability to deal with it. And that's coming out in ways like climate change, and coming out in ways like, the weapons that we can create now are far more dangerous and so forth. The idea that our evolution is kind of been limited is not a new idea, but it's especially acute now because a scarcity mindset where we think in tribal terms, but with the technology we have now, this can't really last much longer. Honestly, it's probably not going to last much longer. So there is a practical nature to it all. Everything in the universe is evolving and changing, and nothing is in a static state. Like by definition, nothing in the world around us is in a static state, and we can't be either. But at this point, it's extremely dangerous to not be evolving because one thing we know from evolutionary science is, you have to be evolutionarily relevant to be here. And I think that these are not nice to have concepts anymore. The idea of growth and learning and mindfulness and learning to overcome fear. I think these are really practical notions as our species, enters a new phase where we will either merge with technology and become more, focused on the consciousness part of us, or we don't really get to stay. It's going to be hard for us to survive otherwise. We're just too powerful from a technology standpoint in order for that not to happen.
So the human element is really important.
I think it's really important. I think that the one thing that really differentiates us from AI at this point is that we have the human element, right? We're no longer going to be able to say that we know the most. There's going to be AI within 10 years that's going to be smarter on being a lawyer than any lawyer, or being.
Oh, they're almost there. I mean, at least in terms of passing basic exams and things.
That's right. But there is a lot of reason for optimism when you look at humans, not in terms of what we can do, but again, having this spiritual element, this side of us, this ability to understand that we're consciousness aware of itself. That's actually the identity that I actually like to focus on the most now. I used to love to focus on, I'm an American in China, I'm an expat, I'm this, I'm that. But I think the only really interesting identity I like to have now is that I'm consciousness aware of itself, and I'm trying to stay relevant in a world where AI and the fourth industrial revolution are right at our doorstep, where I think there's a merger happening between technology and our species, and we're at a point now where it's going to change everything about how we interact with the world around us. And so I think things like meditation and even sort of taking sort of a Buddhist mindset to certain aspects of life, I think are really important at this point. Not just nice to have ideas, that we can talk about on a podcast, but they're like sort of, they should be teaching this in university.
Well, if you look at left brain, right brain, AI and all that is very left brain. And if as humans, we don't develop the right side of our brains, the more spiritual, conscious, kind, emotional piece, I don't think we want technology to outstrip us.
That's right. That's exactly right. Well, and by the way, I couldn't agree more on the development of the right side of my brain. I think, I read a statistic years ago, which I use as a basis for this. I read that something like 1/3 of U.S. presidents were left-handed since the beginning, and I thought that was and then I looked it up, and it was the same for CEOs. That left-handed people tend to outperform, and the reason that they speculated was that they have more balanced brain capacity, because they're naturally bringing in, not just the creative side into overall decision making, but the two brains are resonating more evenly.
Your business path has just been remarkable. Could you just trace it a little bit so people really have an appreciation for you have experiences that really almost nobody has?
Oh, I don't know. Thank you. I think it's a path that made sense to me. It probably wouldn't make sense to a lot of other people. I mean, first of all, most people wouldn't decide when they were 16, I'm going to leave this country and go to a country halfway around the world that I know nothing about, all because I think the business prospects are better than they are here for me. That's already an unusual, maybe not even advisable motivation, but it was my motivation. And then getting to China and actually learning much more about myself than I even did about the culture, which I was already incredibly fascinated with China, especially if you come from a Western country like the U.S., and going to China in 1988 was like a completely different experience. And they were just 10 years out of the, they're 12 years out of the Cultural Revolution, and they were just like 10 years out of the beginning of the reform and opening movement started by Deng Xiaoping. So to show up when I did was fascinating. And then the optimism that was just present everywhere, was intoxicating. And there was so much to learn, and of course, a culture that's that old. Look, anytime you have, anytime when you see like any country, I mean, you have to remember that the people from that country are from a very successful tribe. That only successful tribes get to be around today, right? Even the ones that were smaller, there was always difficulty in competing for resources and surviving, all through human history. And so anybody around today has been successful, every single culture, on all continents without exception. And now you look at the really successful tribes that were, and I'm going to define success in a specific way, which is that tribes that were able to organize in larger numbers and be efficient at scale better than other countries. And China, because it has now the second largest population in the world, but for most of human history, it's been the largest in terms of population. For them to be able to accomplish the things they do, like the damming of the Three Gorges or the Great Wall, or they can apply themselves to very large problems because they have organized themselves in a way which is very unique, that they can be efficient at scale, and in their way of doing things, they can accomplish some great things. And so I got to go there and be part of that, but I didn't know that was what would be so fascinating about it. I was going for very practical reasons. I thought I was going to be able to come there. I remember one example, when we first arrived, a lot of the drinks were served at room temperature in China. And I thought, oh, well, that doesn't really, that means they must not have refrigerators. And it turns out that it's just actually much healthier for the human body to drink liquids, closer to our own body temperature. So I went in with all these ideas that we had so much to teach them, and I actually ended up learning much more, of course, than I ever. So the saying always goes, the first year that an expat arrives in China, they know everything about China, and then by the time they've been there 30 years, they don't know anything, but at least they're happy about it. But my business story was really about just applying my own ideas about where to go without any kind of fear or concern about risk. I mean, the worst thing that was going to happen to me if I failed learning Chinese and trying to go after this crazy idea about building an American brand in China, without any money or contacts or anything. It sounds silly talking about, but it seemed less silly to me than the idea of trying to make it work, when I had what I saw as no real advantages, in the place. So I decided to go there instead.
You're teaching at Harvard now. What 2 or 3 things would you like to have your students take away from your talks?
Actually, I'm really more of a research fellow. I don't actually have any teaching duties here at Harvard, but I'm hoping to interact with as many students as I can, because there's so much I'd like to learn from them, and share, with them. But no, I think one of the things that's really great about Harvard is it's a place of ideas, and I have very unique ideas about how the U.S. and China can exist nicely together for in ways that create mutual benefit. And so these are the ideas that I'm going to be researching here. How do we define a new way forward in this really important relationship that may not look like relationships of the past, right? I mean, when you go through the entire history of the world, there's usually one country or one nation or civilization that was sort of dominant at the time. And maybe there were a couple that were sort of, coexisting. For example, the Roman Empire coexisted with some of the Chinese dynasties very successfully, but they were sort of separated by distance. So I suppose that probably helped it But nonetheless, I think that it's very rare that you have two great civilizations that are both kind of, in their ascendancy at the same time. And the world is going to benefit quite a lot if those two great civilizations figure out a way to contribute their best qualities together. But it is really like a yin yang to me, the U.S. and China and the world today, and culturally and economically. It's just really important that we find a way to do that. So my research here is really about finding a way forward for the two countries that's practical and provides both with the things they need, because it doesn't work unless it works for everybody.
Thank you for listening. I hope you'll support this podcast by becoming a Bump 2 subscriber. Buy us a cup of coffee. It's your support that makes this podcast and website possible. I hope you found something in today's podcast that inspires you along your own life's path, because sometimes a bump in the road is actually a portal into a more conscious and meaningful life.